QIMR Berghofer acknowledges the traditional and cultural custodians of the lands, waters and seas across Queensland, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We support the cultural knowledge, determination and commitment of First Nations communities in caring for health and well-being for millennia.
Welcome to QIMR Berghofer's 80th anniversary podcast. I'm Claire Blake, and we're celebrating 8 decades of bold ideas, real science, and the brilliant men and women who made it happen. We did start in a leaky old army hut, and now we're tackling cancer, decoding the brain, tracking infectious diseases, and rewriting what's possible in medicine. We'll dive into the true stories, funny, messy, inspiring, from the people who made it all happen, and those carrying the torch into the future, because science isn't just labs and data, it's human. And it's happening right here. So you might know Professor David Whiteman leads the world's largest prospective study into skin cancer. He's also the guy that knows how environmental and genetic factors influence cancer. You may know of his work in gastrointestinal cancers, but you might not know our distinguished scientist and deputy director for a while has seen QIMR Berghofer through some pretty weird times. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Thank you for joining us, David.
My pleasure.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary too, yes.
80 years. Can we put a number on how long you've been here?
Well, I started here in 1993 as a PhD student, but then went away for 3 years in the late 90s. So I came back in 2000. So 25 years of continuous service and 4 years before that. So.
Were you pretty excited to start here?
Yeah, I was. Very excited. Yeah, very excited. Yeah.
Whose group did you start in?
Adele Green. I was a PhD student, freshly minted as a registered young doctor who was keen to do some research. And so Adele very kindly took me on, completely raw and unproven. She taught me the trade.
What were you working on?
Skin cancer, melanoma. My PhD, I did a couple of case control studies, they're called. So recruiting people with melanoma and recruiting people who didn't have melanoma, asking them a whole bunch of questions, taking samples and comparing their attributes and features to work out what's different about the people with melanoma. So that was an excellent apprenticeship in epidemiology and in thinking about science and in understanding melanoma and skin cancer. So that's what got me started.
Was Adele a hard taskmaster? Because you have to learn an entirely new level of skill, don't you?
Yeah, you do. But Adele was not a hard taskmaster at all. She was just a fiercely intelligent person who set incredibly high personal standards herself. As a student, all you wanted to do was emulate what she was doing. So it wasn't that she demanded that sort of level, but you just wanted to prove yourself and worthy of being in that group. Everyone in her group just worked hard and brought out the best. So it was a very strong competitive environment. Everyone just wanted to be the best.
We were a little smaller then. You were in the Bancroft building, I imagine, at that point?
Yeah. And yeah, the institute was much, much smaller then. You knew everybody. Certainly the admin and operations team was about, 10 people in total. Buildings and maintenance and grants office was 1 or 2 people. Accounts was 1 or 2 people.
Did you socialise?
Yeah, we socialised a lot. Well, I guess in our group specifically, I made really good friends with the other PhD students going through. So Rachel Neal was one of those people. Rachel and I used to have ding-dong rows. She is a fiercely intelligent colleague and we argued day and night.
I can see that happening.
We argued day and night, but we loved it, yeah. And she will say the same, I hope, when you talk to her.
Were you wet lab back then or were you straight into dry lab research?
My PhD was predominantly dry lab. I did a lot of field work, so I would recruit people out in the sticks. My PhD recruited people with melanoma from all over southern Queensland. So I'd had a University of Queensland old Ford Falcon that they loaned out to the institute. So I used to trundle along out to all these far-flung little towns with my little box of tricks in the back of the car because I was taking skin biopsies from everybody. So part of my PhD had a lab component, so I needed samples of skin from people with melanoma and people without melanoma. So it was a study of men over the age of 50 because they had the highest rates of melanoma. And had really good response rate. About 90% of people we approached said, yeah, I'll do it. And I said, you do realise it requires me taking several samples of skin? Oh, yeah, she'll be right, no worries. So off I'd go, and I'd be taking skin biopsies from blokes in caravan parks, in their houses, at their workplaces, all of that. So, yeah.
Would that be a lot harder to get approved now?
Oh, absolutely it would. I think it probably wouldn't be approved to do it the way we did it back then. You'd probably have to have people come to a clinic and have a sterile environment and all those things, which is fair enough in the modern era. But there was no adverse events from any of this. No one got infections or anything like that. So you can do stuff in the field, of course you can, but there's just a higher level of risk aversion now. So
you famously cycle to work as often as you can.
Yeah.
So your trek to work hasn't changed much over the years. The traffic changes haven't affected you on the...
Well, funny you say that. In fact, the bicycle infrastructure is much better now. So back then I would just cycle on main roads, so up Hale Street, along what used to be Gilchrist Avenue, which is now Victoria Park, but it was just a traffic jam every morning with cars parked along both sides and a stream of cars trying to turn in and out of, there was opening doors and dogs off lead. It was very dangerous. But I somehow survived most of the time, only a few scrapes. But yeah, I used to cycle home down Hale Street of an evening, threading through the traffic onto Corro Drive. And yes, it took a certain kind of stoicism to cycle.
Scientists talk about the absolute leap forward with email and the internet. So was that already in place when you started?
Email just came in. I think I remember having tutorials about it in about 1994. I don't think I had an email address when I first started, but we got them pretty early on. I definitely had an email address in my PhD, but there was no one to email. So we used to just fax people or phone people, but email was barely used really. It started to get used academically, in the research setting by the end of my PhD, so that by the time I was finishing up and writing up my thesis, I was able to email people for advice. I do remember that. There were no websites or anything. There were some very rudimentary list servers, just black and white script. So if you wanted to look up a share price or a Bureau of Meteorology, a lot of those were linked around the world, but there was no research data commonly available to people. So it was very early days.
So you had to wait for magazines and articles.
Yeah. So part of the ritual of being a student and being a faculty member was to go to the library, physically walk to the library once or twice a week, and I used to set aside time to go and do that, and you kind of had to do that. I really enjoyed that because you'd go to the library with the intent of saying, I'm going to find this article that I need to know, and all the new journals would be up on the magazine racks, and it'd be like being a newsagent. You'd sort of go, oh, gee, that's interesting, and you'd pull up a journal and you'd sit down and everyone else would be sitting down and you'd flick through and you'd read papers that you would never normally read, but it just added to your general knowledge of what was happening in different fields, and you just learned a lot. And you don't even, at the time I didn't appreciate that was a new way of learning, that haphazard, serendipitous stroll along the magazine racks, the journal racks, and you'd pick up a heap of stuff and then you go, oh, that's right, I've got it. There was that paper I was supposed to read.
It's quite sterile now in comparison, looking at a screen and going through.
Yeah, and it's a totally different experience. I mean, it's very specific and targeted, so you can just get what you want and do it at your own desk. It was fine. But I used to it was very social too, because it was almost like a reading room. You'd bump into people, you'd have a chat, you'd learn things. So I think it gave you a broader education, a broader awareness of what was happening, which I miss now, as I never do it now. There's no need to.
How did you contact participants before that really became easy by email?
Yeah, we just wrote to them. We wrote letters, put a stamp on it, and did big mail-outs. So one of the really early things I remember that made a difference was mail merging. So you could have a database, and the early word processing program was WordPerfect. So you could stitch together a mailing list with a form letter. So that meant you could print out, 100 letters, which was revolutionary. And then you'd have to get a folding machine if you're lucky enough to be nice to the people in the admin side of the building. You could take your big bundle of A4 or foolscap, take it around. They had a thing that automatically folded into 3 parts.
Wow.
And then you could stuff it into envelopes. Then you had to make sure each envelope had a sticker on it and then put a stamp on it. So it took days to send stuff out, and it'd all go out. But the thing was, the post was very quick then, so it'd arrive the next day, in far-flung places, and you'd get an answer back by the end of the week. So in many ways, you got a high response rate because people didn't ignore letters in those days. If people received a letter with their name and address on it and a stamp and it's got a postmark and it's got a nice QIMR envelope, it looks important. And so I think, it'd be on a QIMR letterhead paper, and so it's almost like a letter from the Queen. You'd be, I've been chosen to be in a study by these guys. It must be important. So I think that helped getting response rates high. And now when you send out a carpet bombing email, it doesn't have anywhere near the same effect. People just delete. So,
yeah, and I think you used to get a letter with your name on it, and that made a difference. But now your name is everywhere, so you disregard everything.
And you just go straight to spam, I think, a lot of it. Honestly, and we send emails to people in our studies now, but I think most of it ends up in junk folders and people never know we've tried to reach them. So it's a lot harder. So for really important studies, actually, we still use a mailing address if we have one for people, and I still think that is a preferred means of reaching people. But
much
it's
more expensive,
really expensive and slow, really slow. So
you're in a fortunate position, and same with Adele. I keep saying she should have a statue of her in Nambour, but you've had this big study and you've followed these people for so long. You're very attached to them, I imagine, and they you. Yeah,
it's funny you say that because the Nambour study was smaller and more intimate in the sense that the research team did very regular assessments of the people in the study, so they did get to know them in a personal sense. Our study is so big, we don't know many people actually in a personal way, except when people volunteer to contact us, but otherwise it's all kind of done at one remove. So I feel very strongly about the study and the people in the study and extremely grateful to them, but I only know a very small proportion of them. But, people out themselves and say, oh, I'm in your study, by the way. And, I might be giving a talk somewhere and they say, oh, I'm in your study. And I say, oh, it's lovely to meet you. I don't know anybody personally, or very few. But, it'll be neighbours and people, and when the kids are at school, they'd be on the P&C or something like that. And I'd bump into people all the time.
There's been no more extraordinary time than when you were acting director and CEO when COVID hit.
It was an interesting time, but it sort of snowballed. When it first blipped onto our screens, I'd just taken over the reins. The previous director had just retired, Frank. He'd been there for a long time. It was in the sort of, summer silly season, so not everyone was back to work in January of 2020 when those first reports started coming in of viruses and pneumonia in China and things like that. But it had an effect on us almost immediately because we have students from China and we have new students who were coming from China who were trying to clear their visas and things. And it was really early in that January, and Queensland Health even then was issuing advice that visitors from the following provinces in China should be put in quarantine or not allowed into Queensland. So it had an effect early on, but at that stage we and everyone thought it would be a local contained problem. We were very fortunate here at the Institute. We have an infectious diseases program. We have infectious diseases specialists, medical specialists, who were able to advise us every step of the way, and they had contacts around the world. So we were, I think, ahead of the curve in just the information we were getting, and these people were very experienced and very sober and somber people. So, we got good advice, and then it quickly snowballed up to be a big thing. But it was actually remarkable how everyone just pulled together at the Institute. It was incredibly unifying. In fact, it didn't feel like work at the time. It was just, this is what you got to do. And because everyone was in it, every member of staff, all the students, everybody just said, what can I do to help? It was great. So it certainly didn't feel like enormous pressure or anything. And we wanted to keep the Institute running. We knew we had responsibility to keep animals in the animal house going, and long-term, long-running experiments that had been set up for years. All of that needed to be maintained, but people just got with the program, and all the sort of usual hassles and petty problems sort of just evaporated, and people focused on the big picture. So it turned out to be, I wouldn't say pleasurable, but it was very satisfying and it was rewarding. In fact, out of it also came new research opportunities. So we were able to redirect a whole bunch. I didn't personally redirect them. People volunteered to redirect their research. so that people were using their skills in ways that could be addressed for COVID. So, people like James Roberts, who does mathematical modelling of brain neurons and things like that, actually became Queensland's preeminent COVID modeller. So he was advising the government on the impacts of opening and closing borders and where to put staff in hospitals and things like that. And that all just came about because he re-engineered his skills into COVID modelling, and it's really helpful.
Clive Berghofer was in the building recently and told me a story about how you managed to get a whole lot of money to do COVID research.
Clive was a early recogniser of the potential impact of COVID, and QIMR is in a place to be able to do something. How can I help? And so he very graciously opened his wallet and wrote a cheque, and the external relations team helped him see that he could be even more generous. we talked with him about being even more generous, which he did. It was just phenomenal. And that catalysed a whole bunch of other people to come out and start donating as well. And the Brazel family as well were very, very important and generous donors. So there were quite a number of people at that point who were opening their wallets and helping us, which was phenomenal.
The addition of population health to QIMR Berghofer has been astounding. Population health wasn't there really when you started.
No, it was called the epidemiology unit initially, and then genetics and epidemiology. So I guess that started with Bob McLennan. He was the first epidemiologist appointed to QIMR, which was a really brave thing to do, because before that time, QIMR was really, a molecular and laboratory and kind of clinical. And Bob came in, he'd done work all over the world, in Europe and Africa and Asia Pacific. So he brought a whole broad knowledge of epidemiology, but then started applying it to cancer epidemiology, recognising that there are a whole bunch of cancer risk factors that we needed to identify for common cancers. And so that's when he appointed Adele Green and Nick Martin. That was before my time, so I might have the exact appointments incorrect, but basically Adele Green and Nick Martin arrived about the same time in the late 70s, early 80s. And they together started working on population studies of cancer and other conditions.
AI coming in is going to take that to another level, I imagine.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how AI contributes to research. It's got enormous potential, but how that potential gets realised is, I don't know. I really don't know how it's going to be used. I think it will simplify a whole bunch of mundane tasks that we ask of it. But whether it can replace a human brain in terms of conceiving of hypotheses and testing them, and I'm sure it can help, but I really hope there's a place for humans all the way through. So it'll be interesting to see. Yeah.
How do you see that we shaped medical research or impacted it in Australia?
I think QIMR's had a really important role. I think it has been distant from Sydney and Melbourne, where I think a lot of the centre of gravity of Australian research is, but I think QIMR's always been recognised, or certainly in my whole time, and I'm sure before that too, as having an exceptional workforce, great outputs, and genuinely the Australian and sometimes world leader in some disciplines. And, I'd put genetics up there, I think skin cancer research, areas of tropical medicine. There's no question that in those areas, QIMR has always had a high reputation, to use a cliche, but punched above its weight. A small city, really, in a small state, in a small country, to have the impact that it does. And certainly in my field and in my discipline, people around the world know of QIMR, and they do that in other disciplines as well. So it's something to be very proud of, given the disadvantages we have of location and distance and small population. It's a great recognition of the Institute, I think.
Happy anniversary, David.
Happy anniversary. Let's celebrate.
If you'd like to find out more about Professor David Whiteman, his team and their work, QIMRB.edu.au. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.